Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for any of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Also happening at the end of today's webinar, we'll be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Avoid Unhappy Returns. Proactively plug your revenue leaks. Our speakers today are Alex Ryback, who's Director of Product Management at Revenera, Victor Demarines, who is VP of Product Management at Revenera, and Venkat Ramdanga, who is Senior Technical Product Manager at Revenera. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Alex.
Thank you.
Alex, I know you are the primary first speaker, and I know you've got a great presentation on tap, so I'm going to go ahead and just going to mute myself and let you get right to your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Charlene. Appreciate it. So thank you. Welcome, everybody. So today, Vic, Venkat, and I are going to be talking about revenue leakage. We'll focus on various topics around that, talk about the various ways that companies are susceptible to losing revenue, and then talk about some revenue protection strategies. And then we'll close out the webinar by looking at a success story that we had with Install Shield, and Venkat will walk us through that. Okay, so before we get to revenue leakage, it's really important to touch on the subject of digital transformation. So when we talk about digital transformation and really what it means today, it's important to understand that it impacts the entire company, right? We're looking at rethinking our operating models. We're looking at how we can become more agile, how we can develop new sources of revenue. And it's really critical to understand that software sits in the middle of all that. Software is the means by which technology advances. It is what's critical to be able to succeed in the current age of digital transformation. And it is the way that you ensure that you keep up with the pace of technology and innovation. And it's really critical to meet your business goals. So when you look at software, it's really important to understand that you need to make sure that you are up to date on what you're doing with your engineering teams, that your developers and your company is able to prepare for new concepts and can remain competitive in the market by being up to date with new innovations. So when you look at software as a competitive differentiator, and it definitely is one, it's really important to understand that software is a direct impact to company success. The software strategy that you employ, whether you decide to leverage open source or not, how you go about selecting components that build up your applications, the culture of your engineering teams, all these things really lead to opportunities for competitive differentiation. Software industry, as we all know, has been growing very rapidly over the past couple of decades, and that it will continue to happen. Organizations are building the software-centric cultures to be able to manage market disruption, to be able to keep improving their time to market and get to markets quicker, and to be able to build better products. We always see that software development is at the heart of opening up new markets, at the heart of exposing new capabilities to your customers. And one of the big drivers of that is open source software. We have our own audit practice at Revenera, and we've seen a standard open source bill of material over the last few years explode exponentially. We typically used to find a couple hundred items when we do audits. Today, it's not uncommon to see several thousands. So it's really important to understand what's driving your engineering work, which components you're using, whether you have the proper systems in place to be able to manage that and make sure that you're doing it properly. And we also see that collaboration is really at the forefront today. Whereas we had a lot of close companies years ago, today there's a lot of collaboration, including with potentially your competitors, making sure that community engagement is at the forefront of your strategy. And altogether, these are the things that can really drive innovation at your organization. So Vic, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. When we talk about digital leadership and you look at some of the top companies that have the most successful programs, you can think of that in 3 areas. Building better products. So this is not just making sure that it's a secure product you're building, but you have a scalable way to install that product, deploy it, as well as managing that software. And that's become more complicated with even the largest companies now, where you have both on-premise applications, you have devices, and you have cloud applications. So certainly a key aspect to consider. Accelerating time to value, really looking at having data-driven insights when you make decisions around your price model, your product strategy, and then having a way to both enforce but also implement your business model and being able to be agile about that, certainly key. And then monetizing what matters. So that's really talking about what differentiates your solution, what makes your products more valuable than the competitors, driving your pricing and licensing model to maximize revenue based on that, and also starting to develop a really mature insight or analytics program so that you can drive your product as well as your business strategy through analytics, and thus giving you a way to really future-proof your business as well. And actually, one of the surveys that I think is often cited is one from MGI Research in 2016, and they surveyed the buyers of monetization technology. And in this survey, 42% of these companies said that they had experience with revenue leakage of 5%. Now, that's a big number. I think it's actually underestimated, because mostly when we talk about revenue leakage in this category, we're talking, companies that are still managing entitlements through Excel spreadsheets, or they're having issues with timely billing, and they're leaving money on the table. But we also should think about unlicensed use and piracy. That's actually another leakage as well as a revenue opportunity that we'll touch on in this organization. So that number can be quite high when we consider those aspects.
All right, thank you, Vic. So let's start on the journey of revenue leakage. So what we wanted to do is present the various types of ways that vendors could lose revenue, and then we'll go into more details on each one. So starting off, first and foremost, on the software side, right? Things like unlicensed use of open source software. So if you are improperly using somebody else's intellectual property, certainly there's risk of injunctions, there's risk of having to pull releases back, there's risks of having to deal with the author of that intellectual property coming to you and asking you for a remedy. Right, so that is an important thing to track and to make sure that that's under control. Similarly, around the open source world is security vulnerabilities. Right? If you happen to release an application and you haven't done the proper job of vetting security exposures, you may need to rush a patch out there. You may, for example, be prevented from being able to sell the software, or have to quickly rush to go ahead and fix it. So both of those are critically important. Then we get into more strategy. So ineffectively licensing, right? You may have picked the wrong licensing model. You may have not got the pricing right. Perhaps you're undercharging. Perhaps you've got the wrong model in place to begin with. And how you package your product. Are you selling the whole thing as a monolith, or do you have various modules that can be upsold and you can expand the price in the future? Then we move into things like customer churn, right? So we're looking more defensive measures. So how do we prevent customers from going away? Understanding what motivates them, what drives the value and customers' perception is critical to be able to manage customer churn. Choosing the wrong business model, again, going back to strategy. Are there things that you could be doing to optimize the value of your solution to the market, to optimize how quickly you can deliver it, and to make sure that it resonates with your users? And then finally, and Vic touched upon this earlier, piracy and license overuse, right? You may be doing everything right, but if your product is being used either unlicensed, or if licensed users are using it beyond the capacity that they purchased, that is revenue that is being left on the table and you're not recognizing. So together, all of these in combination are things that ultimately will add up to the 5% or even higher that Vic referenced earlier. So if we drill down a level deeper and look at the open source side of it, there's a couple really tangible risks to revenue. So starting with security vulnerabilities. So things like unknown exposures. If you are not doing the proper level of security scanning and fixing any issues that have been identified, you basically are releasing your product with unknown risks, and those can certainly come back to bite you. Likewise, if you do know of security vulnerabilities, but perhaps they're below your threshold to fix, or perhaps you have reasons to release the product while still containing those security issues, non-remediated vulnerabilities, another kind of threat vector and risk to your revenue. Things like having older versions in your code base, making sure that even if something may not have a reported vulnerability, if you have a 10-year-old version of OpenSSL, you're certainly leaving yourself susceptible to customers being impacted and you having to do unplanned work to fix your product. Similarly, having unpatched vulnerable code. You may have a vulnerability from an open source component that has a patch which you haven't applied to your product. And finally, supply chain implications, right? If you are a vendor who is supplying code to your customer, they are then adding their code on top of that and selling it to their customers, you're really tainting the entire supply chain, and you could be the reason that the supply chain comes to a grinding halt because someone may not be able to take an application and use it due to a security issue. Likewise, if we look at the licensing side of it, similarly to unknown exposure on security side, you've got unlicensed code, right? If you haven't taken the time to vet all of your third-party ingredients to understand where the code is coming from and who owns copyrights to the code and making sure that you properly attribute ownership to those people, you have unlicensed code risk. You may have something that's ambiguously licensed. So there may be a license that legal hasn't interpreted or hasn't taken the time to review, and that is something that can then bite you later on if that becomes a questionable item in your product. Things like releasing with non-compliant licenses, right? Again, you may not have fulfilled your attribution requirements. You may have certain viral licenses that you're using that may expose you to having to provide source code for those components. And if you haven't done that, there's always risk of you losing your ability to sell software, having to stop, having to patch, and go through unplanned engineering cycles. Improper attribution, right? Making sure that you properly attribute third-party content to the author and give them credit for the work. And then any other unfulfilled license obligations. All of these things ultimately roll up into tarnished reputation, so what we call reputation risk. And these are things that really need to be managed both through your open source strategy, as well as making sure that your engineering teams have prescriptive remediation plans so that they know what to do when any of these issues are encountered. Now Vic will cover the software monetization portion.
Yeah, so certainly a risk to revenue is ineffective licensing, pricing, and packaging. And sort of some of the real higher risk items are overly complex licensing and pricing. And this certainly would have a long-term impact on your business. It can also affect your ability to change and adapt to new market or new end user requirements. But licensing, if it's too difficult for the end user to even monitor what they're using, that's going to create processes in terms of revenue. If there's friction for the end user or enterprises to acquire more capacity or more software products, if it's a difficult process, you can see how that could also increase leakage. And then, if you have bundled your products in a way that's not adding the value to the end user, there's going to be this sense of shelfware. The fact that they bought at a price, at a large price, and only need 10% of that functionality. Some of the other kind of risk areas is when you have an unequal balance on enforcement. And what I mean by that is if on the piracy or the unlicensed use, you've turned up the dial on protection or software mechanisms to prevent unlicensed use, you can also hurt the usability of the product. This can drive up customer support costs. This can limit access to the technology itself and drive end users potentially to other competitor easier to implement solutions. So certainly something that needs to be balanced. And when we talk about piracy and license overuse, now this is certainly applicable to a base of publishers that if you have on-premise software or you have trial software, if you have software that requires to support that offline use case where I have to use the application in an air-gapped network, EDA, CAD/CAM, architectural software, or certainly software that would fall into that classification, chances are you have a piracy issue. And there's the piracy issue of, gee, I see the software on the web, it looks like it's available, to the piracy issue that there's actual businesses using that software. Maybe not a centralized decision to use that kind of software, but it's leaked into their environments and they're using the software without a license. And there's multiple strategies that have certainly over time been tried to prevent that problem. There's always I think the knee-jerk reaction to prevent it. So looking at it as a software bug and I have to protect it and add additional protection technologies, to newer methods, which is tracking that use and targeting the actual adoption as potentially another revenue source. And this is this will be reinforced in Venkat's discussion. He'll actually walk through his own experience with there, but this is certainly a risk to revenue if this is applicable into your market and your application. And then churn, customer churn, is kind of an interesting metric and one that, again, dependent on the type of application. I'm actually showing you an image from one of our usage analytics tools that puts a churn rate up there. But think of churn as being how active that user is within your application, and what is the when do they leave over a period of time? So are they constantly within that application leveraging? Is it a project-based? Or is it unsuccessful in the sense of maybe you have trial software, the user engages with it, but you don't see them return after a period of time. And measuring churn and having that as a metric can certainly help you identify this risk and also ways to mitigate it. And understanding how the user behaves within that application and guiding them potentially to more valuable capability to increase their adoption would be an example of how you would overcome something like that. And then, choosing the wrong business model. Maybe if you've been in the software space, you've maybe encountered these business models and price models that just haven't fit. You've got experience in the field and it's just not working. I certainly have had experience where you had software that was priced correctly or packaged correctly for a small to mid market, but as the organization grew and you started targeting more enterprise organizations, it wasn't a fit. And that would lead to sort of uncontrolled discounting and other sort of challenges that would certainly be a risk to revenue, and not having any analytics. So if anything has changed in the world of late, it's in the cloud paradigm and cloud applications, analytics is a key driver. It's a little bit more difficult if we're talking about legacy on-premise applications, but it's possible. And making that an initiative and a priority is certainly one way to give you that valuable insight to start making decisions and start reducing this revenue risk. And not understanding the true value of your solution or focusing your efforts and your development resources onto those differentiating capabilities, the core to your IP, is another example of not having the correct insight. And then Alex, I think you had a comment on open source as well.
Yeah, and as far as open source, it's kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, failure to leverage open source, you give your competitors an opportunity to leapfrog you, right? We all know that open source is a great way to improve time to value, right? Get capabilities out faster. It's also a great way to make sure that your engineering team is focused on your core competence and not recoding standard functionality that's available out there. So certainly not leveraging that as a problem, but at the same time, leveraging it without having the proper compliance checks in place also puts you at risk. So you need to first decide if that's something your organization is comfortable in doing, and then if so, make sure that it's done properly to where you don't increase your overall risk of using open source software. Okay, so now that we've talked about the various types of revenue leaks, let's talk about some revenue protection strategies and how you can go about mitigating those risks. So first, focusing on open source, right? So again, if your organization is comfortable and chooses to leverage open source, it's really important to make sure that it's done like every other initiative at your company and it has the proper controls, proper governance. There's plans laid out ahead of time to make sure that people understand what's expected of them, what they're accountable for, and what to do in case issues are encountered. So one of the solutions is software composition analysis. We like to talk about it as a continuous process. Right? You certainly don't want to think of this as the last thing you do before you release an application. It really needs to be a proactive, systematic approach, right? It's not just one team. It needs to be continuous, and it really is it's critical to make sure that you protect your revenue from both open source compliance and security issues. So when we talk about continuous, there's really 5 key elements. So number 1, it really needs to evolve from the old school mentality of ad hoc audits or ad hoc checks to being more of a managed by exception process, right? We're talking about shifting left, we're talking about early and often developer involvement, we're talking about identifying issues even before you implement any code during component selection, and making sure that you encounter and solve any remediation issues as early in the process as possible, thereby reducing the cost. We're also talking about making sure that it is integrated, right? You don't want to do SCA as another external task, right? It needs to be something that's integrated into the engineering toolchain. So we're talking about integrations to the IDEs, to developer coding environments, integrations to build, integrations to source management, integrations to defect tracking systems. All of those will make it more of a part of a continuous engineering process, and will keep your developers focused on their work, which is innovating the product, and not so much having to shift into a completely different process and a different application. The third really key point is monitoring, right? Just because something is acceptable today does not mean that it doesn't age out, doesn't change licensing, doesn't encounter new vulnerabilities. So this is not a static result. Components that are perfectly acceptable day 1 may not be day 10. So it's important that you have processes in place for continuous rescanning, and most importantly is monitoring and alerting users in case there's any sort of compliance events that come up after initial review. And these can be in multiple categories. We can be talking about new security vulnerabilities being discovered. We can talk about a component that has altered their licensing, and we've seen a few cases of that the past few years. We can talk about components that have just fallen out of favor. Could be that a component is active and getting a lot of adoption, and suddenly there's a new component, new shiny object that comes out, and the activity from the market and the community that's been supporting it drops drastically. So another important thing to look out for. And then most importantly is having a process for initiating remediation and making sure that you're continuously patching your vulnerable code. Okay, Vic.
Yeah, so when we talk about software monetization as a platform, it really embodies a lot of capability. Certainly software licensing is one of the core, but entitlement management traditionally is, you may start with licensing and then grow into the need for entitlement management, but that's where you're managing your accounts, your users, your devices, having those mapped to the entitlement for what they're allowed based on what they purchased, really driving revenue from that perspective. Usage tracking, having both the insights in terms of what products have been updated to all the way to what is being used, and even leveraging it from a license model, like a usage-based consumption model, and also compliance, which we'll touch on. And then there's really the whole update and software delivery aspect of it that often organizations miss, and that's kind of critical because as a software publisher, you need to make sure that you're delivering the most secure, available patches to your install base, and you're doing it seamlessly, but you also have the need to make sure that they're entitled to it. So if you're on a particular version or maintenance plan, you get this update. If not, you need to purchase up to the latest and greatest, and that's certainly a way of driving revenue, but it's a key component of that monetization platform.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that software composition analysis really fits into kind of this wheel here, because anytime that you deliver any assets outside your company or host a new release of something, you're susceptible to new inclusions of third-party dependencies. So during delivery, during software updates, it's important to take the topics we discussed in the previous couple slides and make sure that that is continuously being monitored as part of these two activities.
Yeah, so let me drill in a little bit more on usage analytics, and this will also help with, Venkat's going to talk about an actual application of this. But when we talk about usage analytics, I want to make sure there are two aspects, important aspects to it, especially when we talk about revenue protection. So license compliance, we talked about prevention versus tracking. Well, with license compliance analytics, so the ability to detect when the software is not being used unlicensed, either through attributes in the license file to actual tampering that might be occurring or some other condition that it can be tested within the application installation, using that to identify what organizations are leveraging that, and then developing that really into a compliance lead to allow the publisher to act on it and make that organization compliant. And the goal there is to convert that unlicensed use into paid use and retain the customer. So there are ways of collecting this data, presenting this data in such a way to optimize that revenue. And of course, any good organization, end user organization, doesn't want to have unlicensed software within their enterprise. It's certainly a risk for them. So positioning it that way is probably the strongest way to do that. Product usage is really peeling the onion. It's not necessarily tracking what accounts are using which products, but it's what features are being adopted within that application. And that level of feature usage can certainly help drive your product roadmaps. It can also tell you where there are cross-sell and upsell opportunities. And most analytics of this sort will have in-app messaging, so you can actually deliver content or positioning or guiding guides to the end user as they're using the application, and certainly a key way to address the churn risk. Yeah, let's turn it over to Venkat in terms of your success story with Install Shield.
Sure. Thanks, Vic. Alex, can you move on to the next slide? All right. Hello, everyone. This is Venkat, and a brief introduction about myself is I am the product manager for Install Shield, and for today's session, I'd like to share my experience with how we have been managing revenue leakage challenges or the problems that we face, in the Install Shield product. So today, there are really two types of leakage we actually face in Install Shield. One is the first one is which Alex talked about, managing open source components. So we used to have, pretty, afterthought process of, doing an ad hoc audit, which we had to evolve from that process to, managing open source components as a part of the development process. So we now have a very good tool integrated right into our development process, and with every individual security alert or a security vulnerability that is being flagged, the engineering manager is alerted, and we act on it then and there. And then we also have a pretty good seamless and automated process of generating the third-party notices, which used to be a very tedious and a manual process earlier. So we we have a well-established process for that as well. And the real important topic that I wanted to cover for today is the license overuse and the piracy use case. In order to get into this, let me talk about the history of Install Shield. So Install Shield has been in the market for over 30 years now, and it has been it's established itself as a gold standard for developing installers for software vendors for a really long time. So when it comes to a software vendor to generate an installer and distribute it to their customers, Install Shield is definitely the top one in the list. Right now, this makes Install Shield an easy target for piracy. Right, and if you look at Install Shield, Install Shield is probably the most pirated solution from Levelera. And for a long time, most of the releases that we've been releasing, have been victims of piracy, right? And and we have been trying to plug these holes. Whatever licensing solution we try to use, there are people who find out ways around the existing licensing software and come up with cracked versions of Install Shield and feed them to the piracy websites. So this has been a real challenge for us, how to deal with the pirated copies of Install Shield and people who are trying to use these copies. And the primary users who use the pirated copies of Install Shield are not just a college student who is developing his own Windows app and trying to distribute it to a small set of customers. We actually see that that genuine software service providers who get a lot of contract work from customers either from NAM or EMEA regions, and then they tend to use a lot of pirated copies of install sheet because they can save a few $1,000s in getting this work done, right? And the other big challenge that we also see is a license overuse, where our genuine customers, some of the genuine customers actually try to work around the system, reach out for support, have a single license key, and then try to reach out to support and say, hey, my license key is no longer working. I'd like to activate it on another machine. So this also has been a pain point for us, in terms of revenue leakage. So today I'd like to share my experience with how we have been using compliance intelligence as a solution to integrate with install sheet, and how we are able to plug these revenue leakages. So there are two kinds of use cases that we were targeting when we started this integration process. The first one obviously is piracy. So there are people who generate these tamper DLLs, binary tamper. The first one is piracy due to binary tampering, where there's a genuine DLL of install shield coming from Revenera, and then people try to hack around or reverse engineer the existing DLL and place some code in malicious code in there which can bypass licensing. So that's one kind of piracy we're talking about. And the second kind of piracy could be DLL hijacking, where people can share a DLL which is supposed to be a Windows DLL, and all they need to do is place a place a DLL which looks like a Windows DLL, and it is placed in the location of install shield, and it bypasses licensing, right? So there are two kinds of piracy that we started to analyze. Have been looking at for a really long time, and we're trying to target how we can capture these piracy use cases and send them over to us, and so that we can go behind these users and try and monetize them. And the second, we talked about it, the license overuse. Our licensing model, the two types of licensing model, which is the node lock and concurrent licensing model. So concurrent is really okay, but the most abused licensing model is the node lock license, where even genuine existing customers try to work around the system and reach out for support for additional activations. Alex, next slide, please. So how did we go about it? I mean, the moment we knew that compliance intelligence has a way of understanding the piracy or the license overuse, which can send data back to us and understand which kind of users, who are these users, which kind of additions, which kind of versions of install shield they're trying to pirate. We started talking with the compliance intelligence team, understand the integration steps. So really two steps. Basically, the one is the first one is the SDK integration. So compliance intelligence has got an SDK that needs to be integrated into install shield. All we had to do was understand the best practices for integrating it, what kind of data we have to collect, what kind of additional information we'll have to collect, and what kind of piracy we want to actually track. Right? And then really integrate into the product. One thing which I've noticed is that the compliance intelligence SDK integration has been a really seamless process, and the overall integration took less than 2 weeks for the engineering team. So we really had no issues in adjusting our schedules to just accommodate one developer 2-week effort into integrating with install sheet. Another real main piece is about how we analyze the data that comes back from our piracy users back into the system, right? I mean, so you get all of these pirated copies of install shield out there in the wild, and people begin to use it, right? So what do we actually make use of this data as? So we get the data, we review the data in the compliance intelligence portal, and try to analyze between what is a genuine usage versus what is a piracy usage, or what is a license overuse usage. And then we create opportunities, and we have a workflow setup which we can pursue with these pirated users. So we have a special team who actually does this job for us. This is called the data success team from compliance intelligence. So they're responsible for reviewing and fine-tuning all the data that comes from our existing customers. Alex, next slide, please. So coming to the specifics of integration, so since we wanted to target both piracy users and license overuse. So what we had to do was we had to collect all the usage, not just piracy, not just people who are using the binary tampering or DLL hijacking kinds of install shield, but we also wanted to understand who are these genuine users who are trying to go around the system to for additional activations. So we began to collect all usage, not just piracy usage. And we kind of, for the first release, which happened just in May of this year, we started targeting just the node lock licensing model, because node lock licensing model is the most abused model in install shield. So, and we started collecting some information and sending back to the compliance intelligence portal. So one is send the tampering mechanism so that we understand what kind of cracked versions of install shield are there, what kind of techniques people are using to crack install shield, so that if at all there is an opportunity, we can plug those holes as well. And then send a serial key for analyzing the overuse scenarios. So whatever node lot customers we have currently, they're using serial key for their activation of their copy. And if we have to understand that if the customer is overusing an existing license or not, I mean, we can get it. We can analyze by getting the serial key from the installed copy of install shield and cross-validating it against our licensing portal, so that we understand how many of these instances are genuine requests for more activations, or how many are not. And some additional information that we collect also is the company name and the actual publisher name, which is from the digital signature, so that we understand that if you recall, we talked about genuine service providers trying to get some contract work from companies from either NAM or EMEA, and these service providers are probably located somewhere in either Uganda or some other country where we can't really reach out to them. But if you understand that the publisher information is actually from a proper registered company in North America, right? So getting the company name and the actual publisher name from the digital signature helps us understand who is the actual software company who is benefiting from install shield. It's not the service provider firsthand, but it's actually the main company who is outsourcing the work to the service provider. This is about one of the things that Alex has been talking about, supply chain implication. And then we also send the edition information, where we see that which edition. We have three kinds of editions. Which edition is actually being pirated, or which edition people are trying to use more instances as. So what's the result? So we have successfully integrated compliance intelligence into install shield, and the first release of install shield, which is integrated, has been released in May 2020. And then, as expected, we saw that the pirated copies of install shield is readily available in the most common piracy sites. And we started working with our data science team, and the data science team started looking at the data that is coming in. Isolated the genuine usage versus piracy and overuse cases, and within 2 weeks we could really identify an additional 6% of opportunities against our total year. Next slide, please. So this is the data so far. So we have released in May. So you can see that in May there is half of the data that has come from install shield 2020 is pirated users. If you look at this data is a little interesting, because as much as there is licensed users, there is an equal amount of pirated users. So it's also because of the popularity of the product, and it's readily available in the piracy website. So the real challenge is trying to understand this exact bifurcation of license versus piracy. Who exactly are the pirated users, and pursuing these opportunities to closure. And the other interesting data point that compliance intelligence gives is where are my pirated users positioned across the globe, right? If you look at the pie chart here, so we see that bulk of these pirated machines are coming from Asia, and definitely some from Middle East and some from Europe region. So the data analytics from compliance intelligence is so strong that we can understand where exactly the user is using the pirated copy. Next slide, please. So this is one more data point about potential overuse. So we also talked about how we can track overuse of the licenses that we already sell to genuine customers. So we see that there are a few instances where people are trying to use more than more than the instances that are supposed to. Right? And the second chart is against all our customers located by region. Next slide, please, Alex. So how do we go about, once we get the data, so how do we go about, pursuing these opportunities, right? So we got a team, with us, who we partnered with, which is called, I think, a revenue recognition services team. I think, it's called, SCG, Software Compliance Group. So, we, work with them closely, and then we flag the piracy targets, and then, release them to the SCG team, right? And the SCG team really, goes ahead and, pursues these people who are trying to either pirate install sheet and conduct a preliminary investigation, understand their financials, and then send them an engagement letter to say, hey, you have been a victim of piracy, and you have been using a pirated copy of install shield, for so and so duration, and please respond to us with the next steps, right? And then we follow up with them over phone or email, and wherever it is required. Sometimes a customer or a user might not be knowing that they're actually overusing, or they might be using a pirated copy of install shield because some developer tried to be smart, right? So we try to show them the proof of the piracy wherever required, because we have the data that we're collecting from this particular user. And then we just go ahead and settle with the user to say, hey, you might just be a victim of piracy, let's close this up, right? And then we move on to the next opportunity. So this is how we have been using compliance intelligence to plug the primary use case of piracy usage in install sheet, trying to pursue those users who have been using pirated copies of install shield. How we can actually monetize those monetize from those opportunities. Thanks, Vic and Alex, for letting me share the success story from install shield.
All right.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. So I think one thing that's important to stress here, and the reason we had Venkat go through that, is we really want to be able to utilize our own solutions, right? So we can offer some insights to our customers. And this is a great example of combining both our SCA solutions as well as software monetization ones that really show the power of putting them together and being able to address revenue leakage in a real life example that can benefit our customers. So looks like we have some time for questions, and I think there was one posted, so I can answer that. And then meanwhile, if anybody has any other questions, please go ahead and post them. So let's see. So there was a question earlier around what does shift left actually mean within the context of software composition analysis. So when we talk about shift left, we really talk about taking all of these activities that you're doing while scanning your open source and reviewing your bill of materials and making decisions and putting them as early into the development process as possible. All right, so shift left in general talks about the software development lifecycle and front-loading activities to the left side of the curve to make sure that you have early visibility into something, to make sure that you can minimize the exposure window, and to make sure that you can minimize the cost associated with fixing something earlier on the process, as opposed to having to remediate a product that is already out in the field and has been delivered to customers.
All right, we have questions, lots of questions, time for questions, guys. So if you do have a question, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit it, and we'll try to get to the questions that come in. Sorry, Alex, didn't mean to cut you off there.
All yours.
All right. So let's see, here's another question that's come in for you. You talked a lot about usage analytics and using data to drive revenue. So how long does it take to get enough data to start doing that? And are there any quick wins you'd recommend that would help me demonstrate the value to my management team?
Yeah, let me take that one. So if we just talk about in terms of the time it can take, it can certainly be done quickly, and I would recommend an approach where you would do a more crawl, walk, run before you would try to centralize this across your products, or put more investment in, because you want to prove the value as early as possible. So in the Install Shield case, those analytics helped directly tie to revenue, so that was great. And it wasn't so much investment. I think Venkat's team, it was less than a week in the actual integration of the technology. And you want to look for quick wins like that. You want to look for a scenario, maybe you have one product that you would trial your analytics on and implement it, and then based on that data, seek additional justification to expand the program. And there's good use cases, not just from compliance, but also on usage. So maybe you can use the early data to show a feature that should be deprecated or end of life, or a platform no longer needed. Some simple use cases from a product perspective to really justify that investment in resources. And when we talk about resources, software companies often will start by building their own sort of solution around analytics, and normally what I see, and that can certainly work if you have a lot of experience and depth in that. Some of the challenges with that is you're not able to share the data. You don't consider what other roles within the organization may get value out of that. So before you embark on a strategy of build or even buy, you want to evaluate the tools that you want to use. But again, I would say try to keep it simple. Start with just one product, get the value out of it, and then expand as you see those different justifications and potentially the revenue impact.
All right, great. Next question here. Let's see. There are all kinds of code scanning tools and vendors out there. So is there a strategy you recommend for deciding which is the right solution?
So I can take that one. Sure. I mean, there's several strategies, and I think the first step comes down to really understanding the culture of your organization. And this is something that may not be consistent across your org, right? It can vary by business units, by product teams, but really understanding what is driving your need. Are you scanning for early and often vulnerability discovery in open source, and that's really kind of what you're after? Or do you have needs around a compliance program where a software bill of material being complete and accurate is really the end goal? So depending on which of those two, or maybe it's a combination, you need to look at which vendors can support those use cases. We see cases where there may be a multi-vendor strategy in play, or maybe you select a partner that you feel confident in and have them address both of those scenarios. So it really depends on really understanding your need and then matching it up to the capabilities of the vendors out there.
All right, great. Just a quick reminder, folks, there's plenty of time for questions. So if you do have one, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit it. Next question here. Can you talk a little bit more about what you meant by balancing license enforcement? And how does that play into managing entitlements?
Yeah, so I think there's two thoughts there. So what I meant about enforcement are the techniques that you use to enforce your licensing. And in some cases, software companies might use hardware dongles to secure their application to a particular user, or they use some advanced network based methodology to protect that the server doesn't get cloned. And enforcement, is sort of a natural component to license management, but it's also one that I think is under the most change in the industry now, because as you have applications connect more so to cloud-based licensing servers and you're getting more analytics, you can lighten that enforcement to allow for more business models. And that's what I meant about the balance. I think the balance is pretty key, and I think it's shifting more to make the software more available and monetize through the back end. And when we talk about back end, that kind of leads into entitlement management. Am I managing this in a spreadsheet in terms of who's activated and what licenses are applicable to which customers, or is it some homegrown solution which is not allowing you to tie into third-party systems, or you can't extract the data for business intelligence, or is it more of an enterprise entitlement management solution that's going to be governed by the size of your business and your growth. But entitlement management is that one certainly capability you'll need to help scale how you maximize revenue.
Excellent. All right. Here's a question. Do you have any case studies of customer success stories?
Yeah, maybe for both of us, I guess. Certainly there are case studies that are available on our site that talks about, replacing homegrown solutions with our software monetization platform. We also have compliance, when we talk about usage analytics and compliance analytics, several case studies that talk about the impact, the revenue impact, and the impact to the product planning based on usage analytics. So certainly there's a few of those available on our site. Alex, how about you?
Yeah, likewise on the software composition side, there's content on our website that talks about value that customers have received by deploying our solution, and some strategies around how to deploy it and how to gain success out of it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, great. And we just sent out over the chat a link to a case study. So hopefully that will be of value to you. Next question here. Let's see. Do you have recommendations as to how to start this conversation about revenue leakage internally? I'm guessing leaders are addressing it at some level, but perhaps not as it relates to the points you presented. So who should be involved?
Yeah, that's maybe both of us again. If we talk, maybe if we break it down into, I think one of the key things you have to do to get this conversation going and to start planning is to have metrics. You need to measure these challenges that you're having that can contribute to revenue risk. So I'll just talk in terms like software monetization. What's the time it takes to bill a customer? What are how many people are involved in that process? How many are you measuring? How many billing disputes there are with your clients? Revenue per SKU. Are there SKUs? Do you have a complex SKU system? And as you break it down to revenue, if you can you look at that model and say, how do I simplify this? How do I simplify my license model and how I package my products to meet the end user goal? And then number of discounts. I kind of mentioned that earlier. If your pricing and your licensing model is kind of out of whack, if you try to look at the occurrence of discounts and how many were controlled and uncontrolled, usually something you can probably pull from your CRM system. And then on that whole topic about piracy and unlicensed use, there are easy ways to both externally validate whether you have a problem and internally getting field expertise through your support channels or your inside sales or your field salespeople to kind of build up a set of metrics to suggest that you have that challenge as well. How about you, Alex? Do you think the metrics are the best way to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think in software composition analysis, it's a bit of an unnatural act because developers are typically our end users, right? They're the ones who are doing this as part of their work. I don't think developers are necessarily revenue motivated, but certainly from top down, anybody who is organizing a compliance program, so legal, security, or CISO, revenue definitely resonates at that level. So that's just another data point that feeds into what can we do better, how do we maximize revenue, minimize costs, and certainly getting your open source house in order is one way to contribute to that.
Excellent. Okay. All right. Well, that is all the questions that we've gotten in. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the question and answer period. If you do have a last minute question, you can still go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel. And please know that the folks from Revenera will be getting a copy of all of the questions that came in. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always go find it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Okay, at the top of the hour, I did mention that we would be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get that done. Our first winner today is Alan D. Congratulations, Alan. Our second winner today is John H. Congratulations, John. Our third winner today is Robert P. Congratulations, Robert. And our final winner today is Matthew R. Congratulations, Matthew. And we'll be checking, we'll be sending you messages online via email to get your $25 Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. If you don't see anything in your inbox, please check your spam folder. All right, I just now want to thank our speakers today for such a great presentation. Lots and lots of really great visuals and information during the webinar. So Alex, Victor, and Venkat, thank you all so much for such a great presentation. Really appreciate your time and your expertise.
All right. Thank you, Charlene. Thanks to all the attendees.
All right. I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.